Good morning. Thank you for joining us this Sunday morning at Colonial Hill Baptist Church. I'm Ernie Armstrong, and it's my privilege to lead in Bible study this morning from Colonial Hill. Today is our last lesson from Ezekiel. Next week we will begin studies from the book of Daniel. Daniel was a contemporary of Ezekiel, but had different experiences and different insights. Now, today's lesson is also the National Sanctity of Human Life Day. Churches have been observing the National Sanctity of Human Life Day since January 13, actually since January 22nd, of 1984, because it was on January 13, 1984, that President Ronald Reagan declared a National Sanctity of Human Life Day to be observed that year on January 22. Now, why did President Reagan choose January 22 as the day for the observance of sanctity of human life? That was because it was on January 22, 1973, that the United States Supreme Court handed down the decision in Roe versus Wade, which legalized on-demand abortion everywhere in this country. Presently, there is a case before the United States Supreme Court, argued just a few weeks ago, dealing with a statute out of the state of Mississippi, which, by the way, is very similar, but not exact, to a statute out of the state of Texas. But it is the Mississippi statute which prohibits abortion after the 15th week of pregnancy, based upon speculation, because of course that's all it can be at this point in time, but the speculation being based upon the questioning and observations of some of the 9 justices of the U.S. Supreme Court. There are many who believe that the Supreme Court will sustain or not overrule the Mississippi statute, thus holding it to be constitutional, or at least not unconstitutional. And some think the Supreme Court may go all the way to overruling Roe versus Wade and at least restore to the states the right to enact and pass their own statutes dealing with the subject of abortion. Now, we already know that states like California and New York seem bent on approving and authorizing abortion. Abortion is the taking of human embryos prior to the physical birth of a child. Pro-life believers attribute that to or consider that to be murder. Today's lesson from Ezekiel, we are going to see how the taking of a child's life is an abomination to God himself. And so we're going to look at passages from Ezekiel chapter 16, verses 20 and 21, as well as Ezekiel 23, verses 36 through 39, where God pronounces through Ezekiel his judgment upon Samaria and Jerusalem. And we'll talk about that just a little bit more. And then we will look and finish our lesson with a look at Psalm 139, where David reflected on God's awesome power to show that God values all human life. Let's look, beginning Ezekiel chapter 16, verses 20 and 21. And we're going to see in this chapter, and also some in chapter 23, God uses some of the most graphic, even gross language in all of the Bible to to describe the horrible things that his people have done, and to show his, I'm going to use the word disgust. I don't think it's in the scripture passage, but his disgust at what they were doing. Chapter 16, verses 20 through 21. And you took your sons and daughters, whom you bore to me, and sacrificed them as food to the idols. Was your prostitution not enough? You slaughtered my children and sacrificed them to the idols. In all your detestable practices and your prostitution, you did not remember the days of your youth, when you were naked and bare, kicking about in your blood. Wrongdoing is justified in the eyes of those who are sinning horribly before God. Ezekiel 16 describes the wickedness that God's people had displayed. He had created them. He had given them all that they needed, yet they turned their backs on him and worshiped idols. That's the prostitution, the reference to prostitution, the worship of idols, instead of worshiping him who had provided everything for them. They also had disregarded his commands, his word, choosing instead to adopt their neighbors' pagan worship practices. As I mentioned, the Lord vividly describes the people's wicked use of their own children who first belonged to God. God said, whom you bore to me. He says that through Ezekiel. And then he references them also as my children. And they had misused their own children, God's children, in pagan sacrifice. God had created life. He had enabled the mothers to conceive these children, and he had brought them to birth. We know that children are a special blessing from God. King Solomon in Psalm 127, verse 3 said, sons, this is New International I'm reading from, some translations say children, but sons are a heritage from the Lord, children a reward from him. And then in the New Testament, Jesus himself in Mark's Gospel, chapter 10, is quoted as saying in verses 14 through 16, when Jesus saw this, he was indignant. We probably ought to read the sentence before. People were bringing little children to Jesus to have him touch them, but the disciples rebuked them. When Jesus saw this, he was indignant. He said to them, let the little children come to me, and do not hinder them, for the kingdom of God belongs to such as these. I tell you the truth, anyone who will not receive the kingdom of God like a little child will never enter it. And he took the children in his arms, put his hands on them, and blessed them. So, children are a special blessing from God. God's people should have loved and treasured the children God gave them. Now, Ezekiel is talking about the Israelites in their time prior to the exile, which led up to the exile, which is to some extent what chapter 23 is talking about. But that's absolutely just as an important point to be made today as it was then. They should have treasured the children God gave them. Rather, God was charging them and saying they sacrificed their own children to be devoured, slaughtered, and delivered up as an offering by fire to these pagan idols. Parents do not have the right to determine when their children's lives will be ended. And certainly God never commanded human sacrifice. It was bad enough that God's people had rejected him by worshiping idols. It's bad enough that they had engaged in illicit sexual activities as worship rites. But to take their own children and sacrifice them as if serving them up as food for the idols, as human sacrifices, this was detestable in God's eyes. And so we turn to chapter 23 and look at verses 36 through 39. And I didn't have it all the way marked over there because I wanted to mention verse 4 as well. But let's look at verses 36 through 39, chapter 23 of Ezekiel. The Lord said to me, Son of man, now remember, Ezekiel often preferences his statements to the people to let them know these are God's words. These are not Ezekiel's words. And God referred to Ezekiel as Son of Man to keep him grounded. He was not above anyone else. He was just another man. But the Lord said to me, Son of man, will you judge Oholah and Oholibah? Then confront them with their detestable practices, for they have committed adultery, and blood is on their hands. They committed adultery with their idols. They even sacrificed their children, whom they bore to me, as food for them. They have also done this to me. At the same time, they defiled my sanctuary and desecrated my Sabbaths. On the very day they sacrificed their children to their idols, they entered my sanctuary and desecrated it. And that is what they did in my house. Ezekiel 23, verses 36 through 39. Who is this Oholah and Oholibah? Well, at the first of the chapter, in verse 4, 1 through 4, the word of the Lord came to me, Son of man, there were two women, daughters of the same mother. Some translations just say sisters. They became prostitutes in Egypt, engaging in prostitution from their youth. In that land, their breasts were fondled and their virgin bosoms caressed. The older was named Oholah, O-H-O-L-A-H. And her sister was Oholibah, O-H-O-L-I-B-A-H. They were mine and gave birth to sons and daughters. Oholah is Samaria, and Oholibah is Jerusalem. That's verse 4, chapter 23. So God, through Ezekiel, references the northern kingdom, whose capital was Samaria, and and they consisted of the 10 northern tribes of Israel, and they took the name Israel. The southern two tribes took the name Judah, Judah being the largest of the two southern tribes, with Jerusalem as the capital city. And he says they were like sisters, and they prostituted themselves in Egypt. What does that mean? It means not because he is speaking figuratively of the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, but their people began worshiping the idols in Egypt. And when they get into the land promised to them, they continue prostituting themselves. That is, leaving the one that they have a relationship with, a covenant relationship, which is what a marriage is. It is a covenant relationship between a husband and wife. Their covenant relationship is with God. And if one of the spouses in a covenant relationship, a marriage, goes outside of that covenant, outside of the marriage, and has relations with another, that's prostitution. It's adultery. And God is accusing them of that prostitution, that adultery, because they worshiped other gods made by man's hands. Verse 37, for they committed adultery, and blood is on their hands. They committed adultery with their idols. They even sacrificed their children, whom they bore to me. They had become so calloused that their callousness, so calloused to sin, that their callousness became the norm. Ezekiel 23 is explaining that the northern kingdom's sin, the northern kingdom's capital is Samaria, that's Aholah. The sin against the Lord, said God in the verses before, ultimately resulted in their exile. And to make things even worse, the southern kingdom, Judah, saw all that had happened to the northern kingdom, but they grew worse than the northern kingdom. It was Assyria that overpowered the northern kingdom, Israel, and took those people off into exile. And those Jewish people, those Israelites, never really fully reassembled as a nation people. They became assimilated into the different peoples that they were exiled with. The southern people, however, who saw all that the northern kingdom was doing, who had prophets telling them that God is disgusted by their detestable conduct of worshiping other idols, even to the point of sacrificing their own children. They nevertheless, the southern kingdom, continued to do the same thing. A small sin, unpunished, for which somebody is not held accountable, whether it's punished or not, becomes a mark of callousness. When I became district judge, having been the district attorney for 10 years, I had seen probationers, those who had been placed on probation, commit a minor infraction, a minor violation of their rules of probation. And it was so minor that nobody did anything about it. Somebody might have said, a probation officer might have said, you can't do that, that's a violation of your rules. But there were no consequences for it. And so if there were no consequences, Why not? And so they did it again, and still no consequences. And if there's no consequences for violating your curfew, let's say, and you stay out till 10:30 when your curfew begins at 10, nothing happened. So the next time, stay out till midnight. We all know that not much good other than work occurs after 10 p.m. And so I instituted a program that we called Probation Performance Review. The idea was to get our probationers in front of the court again and to review how they were doing on probation. The idea was not to try to impose sanctions on them, or certainly not to try to revoke their probation. The idea was to try to get them accountable for following the rules, so they didn't just keep on committing larger and larger and larger violations or sins. God, through Ezekiel, is telling his people, you were not accountable. You did not hold yourself accountable. And you just kept on, in spite of the fact that you knew it was a violation of the commands and statutes I had given you. And so their callousness had grown greater and greater, to the point that God says to Ezekiel, will you judge Oholah and Oholibah, meaning Samaria and Jerusalem? The idea is that Ezekiel is now being commanded to judge them, to declare to them their abominable conduct, their grievous sins of many various kinds, but especially idolatry and sexual immorality, and horribly the sacrifice of children. The Lord was challenging the people with the reality of their own sin and trying to have them see that that's why you are in exile. You have been taken out of your homeland. You are being held by another nation in another land. Sadly, many of them still did not listen. Ezekiel lists 4 of the sins that God was particularly upset with them about. They had committed adultery. They had worshipped idols and thus committed adultery. So we had a spiritual adultery as well, in many instances, as a physical adultery. They had blood on their hands. They had murdered their own sacrificed children. And they had even offered up the children that they had born to him. As we've already said, the children belong first to the Lord. Children are a heritage from the Lord. The fruit of the womb, a reward. Psalm 127, verse 3 that we've already read. And God says, and you have built high places. I'm trying to think of the word. A place of sacrificing to the idols. The purpose to burn altars, that's the word I'm looking for. To burn their sons and daughters in the fire, which God not only did not command. Jeremiah in chapter 7 verse 31 says, it never came to his mind that his people would do that. They burned the flesh of their children and offered that as food to the idols. Idols who, of course, are made of stone or wood in the first place. In any event, God hated it. As his people sinned, even in small ways, they became calloused to the sin and began to sin in greater and greater ways. I believe we are experiencing that in this country today. with those who have the task of protecting our citizens, be it a governor or a mayor or a prosecutor, a DA, who refuses to prosecute the laws that are on the books and instead lets criminals return to the streets with little or no consequences. What do you think they're going to do? They're going to commit more and greater crimes. We all, in raising our own children, but in conducting the policy of our own safety, we must guard against compromising God's laws regarding smaller issues, because if we do, we become calloused to this sin. We move on to greater sins. God, through Ezekiel, said, "This, my people have done this to me," and thus pointing out that all sin is first a sin against God and his holy character. But God went on to say, "They have defiled my sanctuary." They thought they were holy, and that if they merely entered the temple area, they were all right. They were worshiping God. And so he says, on the same day, which doesn't necessarily mean the same literal day, but they continued their pagan ways even as they purported to go into God's temple to worship God. Amos the prophet described God's people, how God's people saw the Sabbath as a burden, and they couldn't wait for it to end so they could resume cheating people. Look at Amos chapter 8, verses 4 through 6. Anyway, the people had also slaughtered their children in sacrifice to their idols, which was detestable to God. Human life is precious, but these people, God's people, had become so callous to sin and the sin of sacrificing their children that they did so and still came into his temple and said they were worshiping him. After a while, they become so callous that they no longer revere God. And God tells them through Ezekiel, that's why you were overcome by an outside country and taken into exile. We finish our lesson this morning by looking at what David has to say about the wonder of human life and the wonder of conception. Looking at Psalm 139, we read from verses 13 through 16. "For you created my inmost being." This is David writing the psalm. "For you created my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. I know that full well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was made in the secret place, when I was woven together in the depths of the earth. Your eyes saw my unformed body. All the days ordained for me were written in your book before one of them came to be." In other words, before I was ever born. David describes what modern medical technology has begun to show us. The sonogram that shows the fetus, that shows a child being formed in the mother's womb after conception. How he saw this, he didn't see it, but he was aware of it. He referenced to being made in the secret place, in the depths, being woven together in the depths of the earth. What a great way to point out that the child is a human being created by God, even though we really can't see it. Modern technology, the sonogram, for instance, is allowing us to see it and to emphasize all the more, all the greater that this is God's creation. This is a human being. And to take it upon ourselves to end that life just because it is still in the mother's womb, which we call abortion, is detestable to God, just as the sacrifice of the child who, after the child is born and is outside the womb. God had first claim on David's life, for he had created David. David affirmed, "You knitted me together." Knitted comes from a word that literally means to knit together a cloth. David says, "I am fearful, I am in awe and wonder, and I was wonderfully made." That is surpassingly or extraordinarily. David appreciated how God made him. Even with his limited knowledge. Can we not stop and pause and look to see that we also do not have the right to end God's creation by the act of abortion? That decision is God's. He created and is displeased greatly at our efforts to end that which he has created. This is Psalm 139, is a beautiful picture of God's creative handiwork begun even in the womb. Can we not take every action necessary to protect the life of an innocent child created by God who is not yet able to provide any protection to himself or herself? The Sanctity of Human Life Day this year is this Sunday, January 16th. Some will celebrate it on or observe it on January 23 because it's closer to January 22. It doesn't matter the day. This is something we should be aware of and observe the sanctity of human life every day. Thank you for being with us for this lesson, our concluding lesson from Ezekiel. Thank you. Good morning.